This is the Zac Anesbury Show.
Welcome. This podcast clip comes from an interview with Ryan Buckle from Top Shelf International. The cultural side of things as well. So you dealt with all sorts of, you dealt with the Indian market, Russia, Thailand, Japan, all very different places.
China.
And China as well.
Yeah.
How different is it working in each of these cultures? What's the same and what's different? And you know, is it, are some of the, I don't know, international marketing sort of courses are a little bit, I don't know, cliche, like holding your business card with two hands, and how much of that is textbook, and then what's the actual real reality behind working in different countries?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think I sort of learned this as I went. I was probably lucky at the start of the cultural nuances of different markets. I had a really great mentor that was in the marketing team with me who'd been involved in, he was an Aussie, but had been involved in lots of these markets. And so it was sort of like, here's the cultural 101 you need to understand. And there are some things that you just need to be really aware of. You'll get away with it maybe once or twice as someone who's new, but if you do make the effort to do these things well, like the general two hands thing in Asia is, you know, reading the card, read it front and back, and you know, you don't just put it in your side pocket if you've got a top pocket, or you might put it in the little your journal or whatever you have with you. I think generally I would say good people around the world have a very similar value set. It's just more about where the lines are, I would say. So you can have great banter with any number of people in our amazing Asia-Pac region, but there is just different ways of engaging. So an example might be in Japan, and I found this actually in a couple of the other markets as well, but there's a get to know you, create value phase before you start really talking about the business itself.
Okay.
Japan would be a good example of that. I made a few sort of missteps in the early journey, and I was one of those wake-up moments in my career where I was like, geez, I really need to get my head out of my backside here and make sure that I'm aware of what's going on. But particularly if you're flying in and flying out, like if you think about it yourself, like it's like someone coming into the Institute in South Australia and sort of spending a week with you and then disappearing again, but is there with an agenda, you know, to try and push the organisation forward, whether it be in the best interest of the local market or not. So creating value is really important. So one is getting to know the people and building a level of trust. I think particularly in more conservative markets like Japan and China too, as a foreigner, you need to understand the business, understand the people, and then show them that you can build or help them build something. And then in other markets, I used to love going to India because it's a real sales game in India. Like I spent most of my time with the sales team when I was there, because you'd sort of learn how they would speak to retailers and, you know, the type of programs that work and those things. So it's easy as a marketer to get closer to some of that stuff. Okay. But what I would generally understand is I think the perspective it builds about how things can be done in this world, you know, just because you've done it well in Australia doesn't mean it works everywhere else. So it doesn't mean that it changes your style per se. It just allows you to have a lot of empathy for how things might be done in different places, and that there's not just one way to do things really well. Then as a marketer, I think there's lots of really cool nuances. I don't think the idea of building mental availability and physical availability changes, but there's some big decisions you need to make. You know, like media in China might be 8 times more expensive than it is in Australia. And so if you get the buyer wrong or the copy's not working well, like there's some big financial ramifications for it. I also think, you know, back to the Indian selling example, you know, you might spend more time in the early days when the business is scaling and you're trying to build distribution about how you can help the sales team articulate what the brand's about and the products, and, you know, sort of old-fashioned brochure selling in a lot of ways. But, you know, how do you do that really well? So I think, you know, all the elements of the mix are there. It's just in a different frame of reference than what the Australian market or a big developed market like in the Western world might look like. And then I think, you know, in Japan's another fascinating one where it doesn't seem anyone has more than 10 share, whether it be brands, retailers or whatever. So it's a very fragmented market. So then this sort of bespoke planning that you've got to try and do to, if you're trying to win in retailer A and, you know, making whiskers bigger in that particular customer, then how do you help them do that rather than just the consumer view? So look, they're all, I could talk for hours about how it's all quite different, but then you'd have other examples where you might go, actually, we've got some real similarities. So say a market, not from a cultural standpoint, but the stage of market, so like Korea and Taiwan might be quite similar in a particular segment in dog food. So then how do you sort of get them to understand that we have the same challenge, albeit very different countries, but how do you get them to work together to sort of come up with a solution that might be big enough to invest in? Because it's the massive paradox in Asia Pac, right? Like there is so much diversity. There's some massive scale markets and then there's some really small markets, but they're all kind of important. So how do you kind of get it to work in some sort of motion that's not massively fragmented and resource spread for the organisation?
Definitely. Do you have any stories about, I don't know, maybe putting your foot in it, or a campaign that you thought would work in a foreign country that just hasn't?
Yeah, so I've got one that I was involved in directly and one that I wasn't involved in. So it's always nice to spread about. But my first experience in Japan wasn't great. I was bloody lucky because Dad had sort of worked in Japan a bit, and so some of the guys that were still there, because the tenureship of the Japanese businessmen is usually quite long. Like they stay at organisations for a very long time. Have lots of very fond experiences in Japan, but the loyalty that they have to employers is something to behold. But I had just come out of the Australian business. I thought I was probably God's gift to marketing, and a few that were smarter than me knew that I wasn't. But just the approach that I would take, I was just like you can imagine a pig-headed Australian coming in and trying to tell the Japanese business what to do, and then sort of firing off emails when I got home, trying to round up all the actions. And basically the CFO, who's an amazing gentleman, but he cared about my dad enough to basically have a word to me and said, if you do that again, you're not welcome back here. So that was a sobering moment I spoke about before, but I was sort of far out, there is a big wide world out here, and I'm going to have to learn to bring a different style to the table depending on the people that I'm working with. It was one of the great ones, though, the Japanese relationship, because it ended up being one of the best ones because I had people around that cared and they sort of showed me the way. And then I think when I left, even today I still get the odd email from one of them saying, XYZ's leaving, can you do a little thank you? And I'm like, this is 5 years after, and I haven't seen them all for 5 years, but amazing experience in the end. They taught me a lot, Japanese people. They're very respectful. They like to do things at a very high level, sometimes not as fast as what I'd be used to, but they do it in a more methodical approach. And I think for a marketer, slowing down in your haste sometimes or fools rush in is a good lesson to learn. And, they're just, as I said, there's lots of retailers, lots of competitors. It's not like, the Coles and Woolies sort of duopoly that we have today.
Yeah.
Everyone's got 10 shares, so it's a very even playing field. So the good organisations are very good because they can do it with a large customer base and they can repeat it year after year. And then there's plenty of examples in the Mars world where I remember a funny one with Snickers and Betty White, the first spot with you're not you when you're hungry, you're playing like a girl today. And I think they tried to run that out in Korea. And violence towards elderly people is probably, for some people they can see the funny side of it probably because it's not literal, but in a market that doesn't necessarily, you're trying to run a Western spot in a Korean market, I don't think it went down particularly well. So the nuances of understanding cultural differences is super important, not only for just flat out respect and being able to work with people, but for business effectiveness as well. You can't just make ads in the US and expect to run them everywhere and for the same sort of results to come out. So it's interesting.
That's incredible. I loved that Betty White ad, and it was quite popular in Australia as far as I remember.
Yeah.
And so they thought, it's great, it's popular in Australia, and I'm assuming other different countries as well, like probably the US where Betty White's from. And it didn't work in Korea. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it probably does in hindsight.
Only in hindsight, though.
No, that's usually the way. But we also, there's tension within the region as well, so you've got to be careful about, languages is on packaging and all of those things are live things to consider. So it's just, I would say the number one lesson out of it is my vision was probably, sort of here when I started. And by the time I'd sort of got out of the region, it was sort of like far out. There's a very big world, lots of different ways of doing things, and sort of helped me build a very different view on what leadership impact was all about.
Yeah. I think it's that actually really ties in really, really well with what you were saying earlier about how, when you're out of that comfort zone, you develop the most, and, you working in so many different countries and almost putting your foot in that example that you gave might have
massively
really moved you forward. Yeah. But that moved you forward so much as a result. So it's kind of like that, I don't know, one door closes, I suppose, but not really. I don't know the saying I'm trying to think of there.
Yeah.
Hey guys, it's Zac Anesbury here with just a couple of quick reminders. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, then make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. There are plenty more interviews to come with some of the world's leading marketing academics and practitioners. You do not want to miss these. In the meantime, if you're looking for another way to connect, then follow me on Twitter at Zac Anesbury. That is ZACANESBURY for my take on the marketing issues of the day.